Well, there are lots of theories of how you achieve civilian control. There are lots of theories about how do you keep a body of people who, by definition, are well organized, equipped with lethal force, know how to use lethal force. How do you get that group of people to obey orders? After the Vietnam War, when the Department of Defense reorganized itself into what's called the total force, the National Guard were integrated significantly into the total force. And this is why when you are in the National Guard, you are held to the same standards in terms of training, fitness, accuracy, etc., health, as the regular component forces. The general public, however, feels under certain circumstances that the president ought to do what his military advisors tell him to do, even though he doesn't want to. That is not appropriate under the principles of civilian control of the military, but much of US society is very comfortable with the idea. And what happens under Eisenhower and then Kennedy and then Johnson are essentially a string of events where the governor was using state forces to oppose federal law or federal court rulings. And the president, who would normally use active duty forces to go in if they were going to intervene, in all of these cases, the president chose to federalize the National Guard of the state, essentially in order to get them out from under the governor's control.
Dr. Cohn, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Given the news background of our National Guard in Los Angeles and the Army's 250th anniversary parade in Washington, D.C., I invited you to our program to talk about the relation between the U.S. military and the American people. I think in your profession, you call it civil military relations. We'll get into that in a moment. We'll discuss the subject in a moment. But before we do that, this is what I want to know. Is this subject actually taught in American military academies? Are you and I having a completely civilian conversation here? Well, I am a civilian, but do you see my question?
I do, of course, and thank you so much for having me on. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. To answer your question, no, not extensively. It's not a core part of the academic curriculum at any of the what we call PME or professional military education institutions. So it depends very much on the focus of the leadership of the academy or other PME institution, whether the students get a lot of discussion of civil military relations. That being said, there is always some content focused on the issue of civilian control of the military and deference to civilian control over policy. And there is, of course, always discussion of professional ethics. But broader content tends to be available only in elective format, if at all. That being said, who doesn't get any training in civil military relations is civilians. So
Oh, really?
when we
That's
talk about
interesting.
when we talk later about civil military norms in the United States and elsewhere, one of the things that researchers find is that the US military, members of the military, particularly the officer corps, tend to have a much firmer understanding of sort of traditional tenets of civil military relations than the general public does.
So let's get into it. What are the tenets of this civil military relations?
Hmm. Well, okay. So there there are there have always been questions about the relationship between the military and society. And just, for your listeners' sake, I would point out when scholars talk about civil military relations, we are talking about a set of relationships that arise whenever you have a specialized group in society that does the fighting. And so when you have a pure militia system, like in Switzerland, for example, you very rarely have what we would think of as civil military relations because the military is almost identical with the society. But in any society where you have sort of the society at large, the people, and then a smaller group of people that does the governing, and another small group of people that does the fighting, then you have a set of relationships, a sort of triangular set of relationships. And civil military relations studies those relationships both empirically in the sense of how do they actually look, and normatively in the sense of how are they supposed to look, or what is healthy, what is a healthy society. So, your question, what are the tenets of U.S.
Yeah.
civil military relations? Um, there are a few that have not changed over time, and there are a few that have changed over time. So the main one that hasn't changed over time is the concept of civilian supremacy or civilian control. And this is enshrined in the Constitution insofar as the president, who is an elected official, not one that has come up through the military, by promotion, for example. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military in the Constitution, which means that he is over the highest ranking military officer, no matter what the situation. So that's one form of civilian control, right? Saying that the person who ultimately gives the orders is someone who's empowered to do so by the people, not by the organization. The second thing that's in the Constitution is, of course, all of the provisions. Sorry, it's the first thing in the Constitution. It's Article 1. All the provisions for Congress being able to raise and support armies, being able to maintain a navy. So the power of the budget. Obviously, Congress can decide when it wants to have an army. Congress gets to decide how big the army is. Congress gets to decide how much it wants to pay for the army. Congress also has the power to make rules for the governance of the army. So what people know as the UCMJ, or the Uniform Code of Military Justice, is a set of statutes passed by Congress that says these are going to be the rules for the military. And all of that is codifying a principle that says the military should not get to run itself. The military should be accountable via the representative institutions of government to the people ultimately. So that is the central tenet of civil military relations for the United States and most Western
With respect
democracies.
to what you just said, military should not get to run itself.
Yeah.
When it comes to the budget, we Americans actually hear members of Congress duke it out over military budget. So it's really transparent from that aspect, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Before we get on to the next subject, I want to ask two follow-up questions.
Hmm.
One, you said this triangular relationship.
Hmm.
So one is the military, one is us, the people.
Hmm.
What is the third one?
The government.
Oh, of course. I sort of thought of the military as part of the government, but you're right, because the government is actually civilian and military is separate. Thanks for clarifying that. The second question is this. You said something interesting. You said it, military officers actually know more about the tenets of civil military relations than do civilians. I thought that's kind of a curious thing to say. Why would we know about it? I had never even thought about that, that I should know about this. Is that why did you say that? Is that something that is actually being discussed in academia or something?
Absolutely. So, first of all, yes, precisely. You've never thought about it.
Yeah, yeah,
The vast majority of normal people, and by normal people, I mean, people who don't sit around all day thinking about these subjects like me,
yeah,
um, have jobs and families and lives, and they do not sit around, as you know, they don't necessarily sit around thinking about politics at all. They
yeah.
certainly are not asking themselves on a regular basis um, deep questions about the nature of the good society and how force should be justified in society, and exactly what the relationship between the people and the military should look like.
I'm
Many
laughing because I'm
people,
confirming what you're saying.
yeah.
Yeah,
Now, that being said, many people have intuitions about these. Almost
yeah.
everyone has a sort of feel when you confront them with a question, they certainly have a sort of feeling about the answer. But, as you know, the job of academics is to become very, very knowledgeable about a very, very specific set
Yeah,
of issues.
of course.
Um, and the vast majority of other people don't know about these issues. And I want to point out it's not unique to the military, right? The vast majority of people don't really know anything about um, the ethics that attorneys have to respond to, or medical ethics. They don't think about the society teacher
As a
relationship
recovering
necessarily.
attorney, I can attest most attorneys don't know the ethics that they're supposed to.
Okay, well, so,
I
but yeah,
hear you.
so the military officers do engage these things to a certain extent because
Hmm.
it is their profession and they are the ones who have to abide by these rules that are set for them. So
Hmm.
they do
Hmm.
think about it, and they do think about when is it justified for me to use violence.
Yeah.
Um, but the general public does not. And yeah, you asked about whether academics discuss this. We absolutely do. We do research on what the general public knows or thinks about these issues, and we have evidence that the general public um, does not accept the what academics and even military personnel would consider the basic principles of civil military relations. So an example of that is the idea of military deference to policymaker decisions.
Hmm.
The vast majority of the general, well, I shouldn't say the vast majority, a large proportion of the general public is perfectly okay with the idea that a military officer should have the final decision-making authority on, say, doing an operation.
Yeah.
Whereas, under the tenets of civilian control, that should absolutely not happen.
I didn't follow that. What do you mean? Yeah, an officer, let's say you're carrying a strike inside Iran, Syria, Pakistan, the officer is in charge of that. What,
It's a
how
little
would it?
higher up. Yeah, it's a
Oh,
little
okay.
higher up than that. So the idea is that if you have civilian control of the military, if the military as an organization is supposed to be ultimately responsible to civilian policymakers who are accountable to the public, then the idea is that, let's say the president is deciding, should I get involved in this Israel-Iran situation?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right? Let's say the president is thinking about that. He has advisors. Some of those advisors will say, yes, you should. Some of them would say, no, you shouldn't. Some of them would say, well, maybe kind of, just something limited. He'll be getting different advice. The military officers around him, so the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as, the civilian Secretary of Defense, the combatant commander involved, so this would be the CENTCOM commander, they may have their own ideas about what is appropriate, what would be effective, right? According to principles of civilian control, they can have that discussion. The president can have that discussion with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and with the commander of CENTCOM. And if they say, so we think this is what you should do, and he says, no, I don't want to do that. According to the principles, they are supposed to salute smartly and say, yes, sir, got it. The general public, however, feels under certain circumstances that the president ought to do what his military advisors tell him to do, even though he doesn't want to. That is not appropriate under the principles of civilian control of the military. But much of US society is very comfortable with the idea.
And you're still talking about they're comfortable with the idea at even higher levels where generals are, advising the president to do something for whatever reason. The president, he or she may not like it, but they carry out anyway because he defers to their expertise.
Yes, so
Mhm.
that is what I'm saying would be inappropriate under the principles of civilian control. Um,
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. You know, up to this point, and we're going to get into it, I just wanted to make sure that I'm following you
Of
correctly.
course.
You haven't distinguished between military operation, presence, decisions. You haven't distinguished between those domestically or those conducted abroad, overseas.
Correct.
Right. Okay, good. And we're going to sort of narrow it as we go through. And I
Hmm.
think a good way of narrowing our conversation and making it more relevant to what's happened in the last week is to talk about one of your papers is a book chapter. It's titled "To Execute the Walls of the Union: Domestic Use of Federal Military Force in the United States." Why don't you tell us about this, please?
So this chapter is, I published this chapter in an edited volume that was looking comparatively across countries on how their legal systems deal with this issue of the use of militaries domestically for law enforcement purposes. But that chapter, from my perspective, is part of a bigger book project of mine that looks at
Oh,
the domestic use of the US federal forces for law enforcement in the United States from 1789 to the present. Um, that chapter basically looks at the legal framework over that time. So you can obviously look at this from many perspectives, actual interventions, what the press said about it, its effect on elections. That chapter looks specifically at the constitutional provisions that are relevant, and then the statutory development over time, the jurisprudential development over time, and sort of looks to establish what is the legal framework in the United States about such uses of the military. And I would say,
hmm.
the general conclusions of that chapter are, number one, the legal framework in the United States is far more permissive than most Americans realize, and I think they're realizing that now.
Far
Um,
more permissive. Oh,
Far more
okay.
permissive than most people realize. And by that, I mean that there are a large number of things that the president can do via statutory and constitutional authority that many Americans don't believe he has the authority to do. He does. Now, there are some things that require specific statutory invocation. I'm sure your listeners have all heard of the Insurrection Act by now, and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But there are lots of things that the president can do without the Insurrection Act. And furthermore, the president frequently has a lot of discretion in determining whether it's appropriate to do these things or not. So, not only does the president have wide latitude in how he can respond to situations, he also has wide latitude in determining when the situation requires response. And that is a lot of power. And so, one of the things that I try to point out in that chapter is that is significantly more power than the framers ever imagined giving to a president, to an executive. The other sort of outcomes of that chapter are the dynamic over time in the United States has been a shift of power, sort of centralization of power, number one, from the states to the federal government. I think that one's well known, but also from the legislative and judicial branches to the executive, um, at least in this area. It's not true in all areas, but in terms of the use of the military, both Congress and the judicial branch have sort of consistently ceded any power they might have had.
Um, this book chapter that is becoming a book project itself is huge. It takes us back to 1789.
Yes.
Um, and this immediately makes me think of, uh, you know, President Washington. We have this war with Britain. Several years after the war, before we were a country, we have a rebellion on our hand, the Shays Rebellion.
Yeah.
The Continental Congress deals with that. And then when Washington is our president, we have yet another rebellion. And that is the Whiskey Rebellion. And, that's, and then I've lived through whatever you want to call them, riots, uprisings. I was here during Rodney King's riots in 1992, and I'm here again in Southern California. What's happening in Los Angeles? As you research this, I appreciate that you said there's a shift of centralization and executive authority has increased over time.
Yeah.
Has the nature of the use of military or militia slash National Guard changed dramatically as well?
Yes. Yes, it has. So, um, you note that the book project is huge. It's in the form of what's called a macro history. I don't know if you've seen books like The History of Salt or The History of Cod, or the one that inspired me was Sven Beckett's Empire of Cotton, which is just a phenomenal book. But it follows a specific phenomenon over a long arc of time. So that's kind of what I'm doing to try to answer these questions about this aspect of civil military relations in the United States. So has the actual use changed over time? It absolutely has. Um, because if you think of the structure of things in the United States, in the early United States, at the time of the writing of the Constitution, and really up until the mid 19th century, we didn't have professional police forces. Policing as an activity was done in a couple of different ways. One was the sort of traditional neighborhood watch slash sheriff who could deputize people to form a posse if necessary for a manhunt or something like that. Rich people had private security, right? And then there was the militia, which could be more or less organized and more or less available depending on the geographic, weather, etc. circumstances. So law enforcement during this period was something by principle in the Constitution, law enforcement is reserved to the states and is supposed to happen at the lowest possible level. So if there's something happening, the local authorities, the local civil authorities are supposed to handle it. If they can't handle it, they can appeal upwards to, they can either, appeal outwards to the populace, say, hey, I need help in this manhunt, or they can appeal upwards to the governor. And the governor could say, I will call up the militia. And what that, as I said, sometimes that was possible and sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes the militia was the unrest. It's
Yeah.
things like that happen. So if the governor was unable or unwilling, there are plenty of cases where the governor simply didn't want to call up the militia because that would cost him money. If the governor was unable or unwilling to deal with the unrest with the militia, then the governor would contact some element of the federal government. Sometimes they would contact the attorney general as the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. Sometimes they would
So
contact
like
the,
FBI would come.
we didn't have an FBI.
Oh, this is back then. Yes, you're
Yeah,
still
no,
talking in
this is
historical terms.
long before an
Yeah,
FBI
yeah,
existed. So
yeah.
this is that's part of the story, though, is that over time we developed law enforcement agencies, specialized agencies to do law enforcement, right? But in that early period, if you as a governor had to appeal to the federal government, they could send some marshals. We had U.S. Marshals. They are one of the earliest. The U.S. Marshals are basically the earliest law enforcement type officers that we have. Um, but if the marshals weren't going to be sufficient, who did they send? The army, or in some cases, the Marine Corps. Um, or occasionally the Navy, if it happened in a port city. So San Francisco, for example, had some labor action at times, and there would, if there was a naval ship in the harbor, they just send some sailors ashore to deal with it. Um, but yeah, during this time when law enforcement was not a professionalized thing, it wasn't, mostly not public employees, mostly volunteers and or private, etc. The the line above the state was the federal government, and the federal government would send the army. Now, under these circumstances, you didn't normally see the federal government federalizing the militia. And again, we're talking about the 19th century, which is the period before it became the National Guard, before the militia, the state militias became federalized or part of a federal reserve. So during the 19th century, whenever this kind of thing happened, whenever there was unrest, civil disturbance, etc., that the state couldn't or wouldn't handle, um, the army was generally called in. That was just kind of how things were expected to go. Now, again, it didn't happen a lot, but it wasn't crazy unusual when it did happen. What you start to see is in the mid 19th century, cities, large cities, start developing professionalized police, but most of the rest of the country is still under the sheriff model. Then, around the turn of the century, you start seeing federal law enforcement agencies develop. You see Border Patrol. emerge, you see the FBI emerge, you see the Secret Service emerge, you see, and you start seeing state police forces. So the first state police forces were Pennsylvania, I think, in 1905.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so what you start seeing is a sort of plethora of other potential law enforcement agents. So you do start seeing somewhat less reliance on the army at that point. What also happens is the creation of the state militias as a Federal Reserve force. But at this point, and so what that does is it makes it easier for the president to bring those militias under federal control. He already had that power. But the federalization of the militias as the National Guard as a reserve component made that much easier. But you still, for the beginning of the 20th century, you still do not see the president federalizing the National Guard to deal with domestic disturbance. Again, most of the time, because if there's a domestic disturbance, the states have already tried to deal with it, and by the time it reaches the federal government, it implies that the National Guard hasn't been sufficient.
Has failed to deal with it. And to go back and um, to one of the things you said, somewhat in a hushed voice, was that some governors may decide not to deal with it for a variety of different reasons, cost, politics, and this has happened back in the one that we often hear about in the news is the 1960s, right?
Well, so I haven't got to the 60s yet.
Please carry on. Yeah.
So after World War II is when things really change. And what happens after World War II is, as you point out, you have the civil rights movement of the 50s and early 60s. And then in the 60s, you also start having the peace or anti-war movements, right? So you have a large number of civil disturbances happening. And what happens under Eisenhower and then Kennedy and then Johnson are essentially a string of events where the governor was using state forces to oppose federal law or federal court rulings. And the president, who would normally use active duty forces to go in if they were going to intervene, in all of these cases, the president chose to federalize the National Guard of the state, essentially in order to get them out from under the governor's control, in order to sort of remove them from the governor's chain of command, because the governor was saying, hey, I want you to stop these small children from walking into the school. And so the president federalized them and said, now I want you to help the small children walk into the school. And this is really the beginning of when we start seeing the sort of civil disturbance mission fall more to the National Guard. At the federal level, the civil disturbance response at the state level was always a National Guard responsibility, always. But at the federal level, we don't start seeing that until after World War II. But then, as you mentioned, you sometimes have governors who do not want to abide by federal law, who want to actively oppose federal law. And then presidents started using the National Guard to respond to that. Then you have Vietnam, right, where famously the National Guard were not mobilized to be sent to Vietnam. So who was available to police civil unrest? Not the Army or the Marines, the National Guard. So again, this is the period when the pattern shifts from using the active component sort of regular forces to using National Guard forces, sometimes federalized, in order to deal with these situations of unrest. And so now we are in an era when the regular army gets used very, very seldom for this kind of thing. And the vast majority of people, both in the regular military and in the general public, think that it's a very inappropriate mission. They don't think it's appropriate. They don't think it's legitimate. They don't like it. And so, we have a significant shift, partly because of this change in praxis, but also partly because we have lots of other law enforcement agencies who specialize in this and are trained for it, who could do this, right? And so people just generally feel like this is not an appropriate use. So even though we have used it this way in the past, things have changed.
And I guess going back to what you shared with me about the 1960s, Ike, JFK, LBJ,
Hmm.
one difference I suppose you want to share, or perhaps I'm suggesting that you share, is that I guess one difference is that in this case, what's happening in LA, not to get so much into politics, but there was not an opposition between the governor of the state of California and any other state and the US president. That's one difference. I see. I see.
Yes.
Um,
I mean, I can talk to that as well. So
please do.
there are, yeah, so this is one of the issues at hand here is that the governor did not request federal help. Now, that is one legal pathway for the president to intervene if the governor requests help. And this is also in the Constitution in Article 4, Section 4, called the Guarantee Clause, right? It says the United States will guarantee to the states a Republican form of government, and upon request of the legislature or the executive, if the legislature isn't in session, assistance against domestic violence. So that is one way for the president to decide to intervene. The president can also decide to intervene against the wishes of the governor, but that is very, very rare. It's happened only a handful of times. I mean, the civil rights era are most of them. There was one in the late 19th century, the riots, the Pullman riots. But it's very unusual, and it basically has never happened without the use of the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act, of course, being a series of statutes that basically give the president the authority to respond to what the president sees as an emergency. I shouldn't say emergency because there's a legal sense of emergency powers, and this isn't one of them. But if the president thinks that there is a situation that requires intervention and the governor is not asking for help, the president does have the authority to do that. What's weird about this time is that the president used a statute that has very rarely been used and generally in connection with an invocation, with a simultaneous invocation of the Insurrection Act, which Mr. Trump did not do. So it is unusual.
I want to ask for a point of clarification for
Mhm.
me, not so
Sure.
much clarification, just education for me. And I apologize if it's way too rudimentary.
Oh, no.
Essentially, American militia, going back to our Revolutionary War, our early days of the Republic, that's what became the National Guard for each state. Is am I?
Essentially, yes. So the states, um, this is kind of a long explanation. One of the big debates around the Constitution, both between the Federalists who supported a constitution and a stronger federal state and the Anti-Federalists who didn't want either of those things,
Mm-hmm.
and among Federalists, one of the big arguments was what form should the military power of the central government take?
Hmm.
The Anti-Federalists and some Federalists firmly believed that any standing army was the worst possible thing in the world, and they should stick with a pure militia system. There were other
As far
people
as
like,
if I may interrupt you, as far as the
oh,
standing army, every time we've had a major war, the one that I know the most about, World War I, we immediately dwindled the army.
yes,
Yeah,
right. So, a standing army simply means that it is around all the time and is
yeah,
training all the time,
yeah.
right? It doesn't necessarily tell you how big it is. You can have a very small standing army, you can have a mass standing army. The United States never had a mass standing army until the 20th century,
Hmm.
until after World War II, essentially. Um, so the early debates were about two things. Number one, should we have only militia or can we also have some standing army? And the second question was, who has the authority to call them up? Now, the Anti-Federalists wanted the central government only to be able to obtain military manpower via the states, right? So the idea was that the central government would only be able to get military manpower by asking the states to voluntarily send their militia into federal service, which is how it was under the Articles of Confederation. The Federalists, and they're the ones who won the argument because this is they got the Constitution passed.
Exactly. Yeah.
The Federalists argued that the central government needed to have power to raise its own troops, whether that meant being able to call the militia directly or whether that meant being able to raise troops directly. So calling the militia basically means asking for a whole organized group of people already.
Yeah.
So those were the big arguments, right? Now, the
And for
states,
the record,
yeah.
the former approach of the Continental Congress, that didn't
Mhm.
work. That's why we had a constitution and a new republic.
So a lot of people thought it didn't work. Obviously,
Yeah.
the anti-federalists thought it was great.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
but yes, the people who wanted the Constitution and obviously the people who eventually won that argument thought that it was inefficient, ineffective, and General Washington was among those people. Um, so all the states were supposed to have their own militia. The states took that obligation at various levels of seriousness, right?
Mm.
Some of them really maintained a militia, and by maintained, I mean like they had a list of people, they knew how to contact them, they knew whether those people had weapons, they knew whether they had horses. Other states were just kind of like, we have a list somewhere, we might pull it out. I don't know if half those people are dead. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
level of organization varied. With the Militia Act of 1903, colloquially known as the Dick Act, um, the what the act did was create a Federal Reserve component, so directly responsible to the federal government, not via the states, and say, we are going to essentially certify the various organized militia of the states to be this Federal Reserve Force, right? Now, that did not mean that states could not also maintain other militia forces, and you will, I'm sure, have heard of some states having also a state militia at this point. The difference there is that the National Guard are the state forces who are certified by the federal government as having met the requirements of selection and training, and they are following personnel policy and things like that. So,
Which
in a
means that they're a real force, i.e., they really exist. It's not that list, you know,
yes,
tucked away
exactly.
somewhere. And second, that they're up to par.
Yes, precisely. So
Yeah.
they are, and after the Vietnam War, when the Department of Defense reorganized itself into what's called the total force, the National Guard were integrated significantly into the total force. And this is why when you are in the National Guard, you are held to the same standards in terms of training, fitness, accuracy, etc., health, as the regular component forces,
Do
right?
members
Because
of
they're part of the
National
total force.
Guard do members of National Guard train separately than other branches of the military?
It depends. So if you are in the National Guard and you're a drilling reservist, which means you're in a reserve status where you are liable for fairly short notice call up. You may drill only with other members of your reserve unit. You may go drill at a nearby army or air base. There are lots of different ways to
Hmm,
do your training.
I see.
So many of them train with the regular component. Um, some of them train only with their own units, especially if you have Air National Guard units, many of those are air wings. And so they do need to train together, but they also train together with the regular Air Force.
Yeah, yeah, I bet. Um, I want to talk about your forthcoming book. Um, I searched this and I think it's really fascinating. The title is On Order, Authority, and Modern Civil Relations. Did I get the title correctly?
Civil military relations, yes.
Civil military relations. Would you like to tell us about it?
Well, yes. I mean, I am very excited that this book is coming out, even though I will admit upfront to all your listeners that I didn't come to a real conclusion. I had a deadline. I had to send it in. I wasn't actually satisfied with the conclusion. But the book project was such an opportunity to think through a big problem. And I am I'm glad that I had that opportunity. I look forward to it being sort of part of a conversation that people can engage in and will take forward because no one knows the answer. So, what is the question? Um, we talked before about the sort of core tenets of US civil military relations.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and we talked a little bit about civilian control. Well, there are lots of theories of how you achieve civilian control. There are lots of theories about how do you keep a body of people who, by definition, are well organized, equipped with lethal force, know how to use lethal force. How do you get that group of people to obey orders when they could use their capabilities to rule themselves, or they could use their capabilities to drain the society of its resources, right? So, anyway, there are lots of theories about how you do this. And one of the leading theories for the last 80 years, no, 70 years, has been from Samuel Huntington, who wrote a book in 1957 called The Soldier and the State. Well, it was published in 1957, which means he was writing it during the early 1950s, which is important in context.
hmm
Um, and his argument, I won't go into the whole thing, but part of his argument was that in order to maintain civilian control of a professional military, right, as opposed to something like a militia, but a professional military, a standing military that trains all the time and is actually very good at using force, his argument was that one of the only ways you can keep such a military obedient and loyal is by creating sort of separate spheres of competency where the politicians live in their policy-making sphere and they understand how to make policy. And the military officers live in their military sphere and they understand how to manage violence. And that these two spheres should in no way overlap. And if you can convince each of those groups of people to stay in their sphere and make only the decisions that are appropriate to them, then each of them will respect the other sphere and not try to intervene. Right. And so what Huntington said is basically that in order to remain under control, this kind of control, there are other kinds, that military officers must essentially be, and I quote, politically sterile or apolitical. And this has been kind of the way that military officers in most Western democracies have been socialized for the last many, many decades, is that they should just essentially pretend politics doesn't exist. They should not get involved. You know, privately, they can have their own political feelings and attitudes and they can vote.
yeah.
Well, there are some countries where they cannot vote, but in the United States, now
Oh,
they can vote. Um, Although they didn't used to be able to, and that's a fascinating story too.
wow.
But they can vote, they can have their opinions, they can even do political partisan type things on their own time. But when they are in uniform, when they are on duty, etc., they are under an obligation not to engage in any kind of partisan political activity, not to even give the appearance of endorsing a partisan type thing. And so this has been the way things are according to sort of military professional ethics for decades. This has never been without its critics. There have been plenty of people ever since ever since Huntington's book came out who have argued that this is in some sense either impractical or actually counterproductive or, not the best way, etc. Recently, and I would say really since the Arab Spring, and then more recently since the first term of President Trump, there has been sort of a critical mass of people saying, we don't think this is the best way to think about this. The problem is that no one has come up with a good replacement. We don't have a better idea of professional ethics than just pretend politics doesn't exist. And so, what I wrote the book for was to try and deal with this. Is there a better way? Is there a way specifically to have a professional military ethic, or just a military ethic if you have problems with the idea of professionalism? Is there a military ethic that is actively supportive of democratic norms and values and governance, right? Because if you're apolitical, you don't care whether democracy exists or not. If you are apolitical, none of that is your business. And so what I was trying to do is think, I looked at democratic theory. So I looked at Locke and Rousseau and Habermas and things like that. Uh,
Democratic with little d.
yes, sorry, democratic little d,
Yeah.
looking at theorists who have thought about, what is the good society? How does it work? Um, Trying to derive from them maybe an understanding of where a military fits in society. Now, unfortunately, most of them didn't talk about the military at all. I mean, one of the few, so
Hmm.
Madison and de Tocqueville are pretty much the two sort of theorists of democracy, small d, who addressed military issues at all. And they don't really give us much that's useful. So then I moved on to, specific civil military relations theorists and tried to see if any of them had come up with something that would work better. I didn't really find anything. And then I spent a chapter looking at actual instances of democratic breakdown or democratic backsliding in various countries, across the world and over time, and the roles that militaries had played in those to see if I could even generate a sort of list of do's and don'ts. Um, Unfortunately, I don't think you can. And the reason for that is that the whole nature of democracy is that it is constantly being formed and reformed by the interaction of the people in the society. People in society change their ideas. The demographics change, the circumstances change, people's beliefs change. And so you
We're
constantly
going through that right now.
Yes, and you constantly have to renegotiate what the rules are going to be and how goods are going to be distributed throughout society. And because of that, and because I think many people cannot agree or decide whether they think the thing that makes democracy legitimate is the fact that there's a process or the fact that they think this process is most likely to produce the best outcomes, right? Those two things can diverge. So what you end up with is if you are purely procedural, if you are, say, a John Stuart Mill fan, right, who basically says the people should get what they want, even if it's terrible and stupid. Like if the majority of the people want it, greatest good, greatest number, give it to them, right? That is one view of what makes democratic decision making legitimate. But there are plenty of people for whom that view is not sufficient. They don't think that it's right to have a situation where the majority gets to decide on everything. They think there should be some principles that the majority doesn't get to violate. So the sort of standard mantra of the United States has been majority rule with minority rights,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
But there was, you know, you brought up a very interesting question that should the military be apolitical, and if so, does that mean that they don't care if it's uh, what form of government we have because they're truly apolitical, and ergo they may not really care, or they are trained not to meddle or care about whether or not we have a democracy because they are apolitical. Would would then this question may be a whole podcast onto itself, Dr. Khan, but just bear with me for a moment. Would another option be okay? They're apolitical, but they're constitutionalists. Do you see?
Well, yes, no, this is the solution that many people put forward, right? Um, Especially, the current context of the United States is a good example of, as you said yourself, we are seeing a renegotiation of the rules. We are seeing a renegotiation of the values. And this happens in democratic societies all the time, right? The constitutionalism response is appealing, right? But if the problem is that people in the society disagree about what the Constitution means,
Oh,
then you still haven't
um,
solved the problem by saying, I'm a constitutionalist, right? Because that could mean in practice some very different things. And so the military is dealing with this right now. This has been a very difficult issue for them because, on the one hand, they take an oath to the Constitution and they take that very seriously and they want to uphold the Constitution. But this is why I talk about the process versus outcome issue. What they are trained in is process. If the law is followed, right? If they are given a lawful order, they are trained that that is the standard that they are supposed to care about. And so if you have a situation which is characteristic of all kinds of democratic backsliding, right? If you have a situation where someone has come to power via the legitimate process,
Hmm.
is essentially using mostly or entirely legitimate processes to do the things they are doing, but those things can be perceived as undermining democratic governance. The military's training is not to look at that and say, is this possibly dangerous for democratic governance? Their training is to look at it and say, is this order lawful? And if it is, I'm supposed to follow it. And if I don't follow it, there are repercussions.
Yeah. Um, we could talk about that for another 2 to 3 hours. I just want
Yes,
to ask
absolutely.
this um, before we go on to another topic, a kind of a softer topic that's dear to my heart. I'll get to that in a moment. But when will your book publish?
The book should be out, I think, July 24th. It is available for pre-order from Bloomsbury, and I think on other sites as well. But Bloomsbury is the publisher, and it's cheaper there.
And if you would be so kind enough to email me the link, I'll include it in the notes of this interview for our
I will
audience.
absolutely, yes.
I told you that I have a question that's sort of softer and is personal to me.
Yes.
Is this look? I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I also
Mhm.
lived in the city of San Francisco when I went to law school there. Um, I got to tell you, since I was a kid, going up to the city to watch the Blue Angels fly over, it usually takes place in October. It was like a huge deal, picnic, and then you're older, you go on even like daytime dates, all sorts of cool stuff. And so this is the U.S. military on our soil, right?
Mhm.
Well, actually above. Or when aircraft carriers or big Navy ships came into the bay, we'd all go watch it.
Yeah.
It was a spectacle, but it was also a proud moment. In my own travels, I visit all sorts of U.S. military force. My family and I have actually vacationed in the Presidio in San Francisco. So I
Mhm.
say all of this to to ask you this question: why are we all Americans? And this is not a criticism. This truly is a question, Dr. Cohn, debating the parade that happened this past weekend for the 250th anniversary of the Army. When we have already had parades in our history, I think
Mhm.
George H.W. Bush had it and other presidents as well. What's why does it feel different? What's different?
Yeah, this is a totally fair question. You know, the United States has a ton of military imagery all the
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
And so certainly there is an argument to be made that it was just a parade. It was just a parade for the 250th anniversary of the birthday of the Army, right? And I think the Army tried very hard to make it that,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
You know, the period costumes, the chronological order, you know, they, I think, were taking very seriously the idea that this was a celebration of the history of the Army.
Which is
Um,
awesome.
which is fun. Yes.
Yeah.
So why was this different if it was in fact different? It was different in certain ways, right? So number one, it's not normal to have a parade that size for a service birthday celebration.
Hmm.
We have military parades all the time, but they're
Yeah,
usually
yeah,
small, they're usually local, they don't usually involve tanks, you know.
yeah.
Um, and and so the size of it, given the fact that it was not the normal circumstances for a parade of that size. And what do I mean by normal circumstances? So the United States historically has had huge military parades in Washington, D.C. and other major cities under sort of three circumstances. One is victory after a war. And you mentioned the last one in Washington, D.C. was the one after Gulf War One
So that's
under
the Bush
President George
senior.
H.W. Bush. Yes.
Yeah.
Um, you know, we had them. after World War II. We had them after World War One. We had them after the Civil War. We did not have them after Vietnam and Korea because there was no clear sort of victory
Yeah.
there. But so victory parades, we have those, right? Clear, yay, we won. These are our boys. Welcome them home, and girls, welcome them home.
Hmm.
The second circumstance is mourning, is bringing the dead home,
Yeah.
right? So, and
Yeah.
that is frequently something that we would see starting at the Capitol building and going down to Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those are much more solemn and somber. Of course, you would not have um, piped in instrumental versions of classic rock when you were doing that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The third one is sort of boosting morale on the home front, both for the service members and for the civilian families and population, et cetera. You would see those during big wars, right? So a parade of this size and this sort of diversity of elements, right? You would normally see that only under one of those circumstances. So that's number one. That's kind of unusual, right? But it's not terrifying. Um, Number two, the fact that the president kept on emphasizing, even though he would emphasize it by saying it's not about my birthday, but he just kept bringing up the fact that it was his birthday, which of course had the effect of making everyone think, wow, he really just wants a parade for his birthday. Especially given the fact that he had made it clear in his first term how much he wanted a parade, and that the his military advisors at the time had sort of backed him off of that, and it ended up being a much smaller sort of show during his first term. This time, I think he was determined. He was not going to be talked down, and he wanted a parade. And it, the fact that the 250th birthday of the army and his birthday were the same was, from his perspective, probably a great thing. The army had been planning a celebration of its birthday, and the president came in and basically said, no, 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 we're going to make this much bigger. And so I think the people who felt off about this, and not everyone did, but the people who felt off about it felt off because the impression that they were getting from the president, from many things that he said, was that he likes the spectacle, he likes the sort of display of military force, of strength and power. He wanted it for his birthday. And to many people, that seemed much more along the lines of a sort of Kim Jong-un kind of thing
Wow.
than than a than a France Bastille Day. I mean, the Bastille Day parade being the thing that inspired all of this, but that's a celebration of, the French Day of Liberation. Um, it's not Macron's birthday. And
Yeah.
so again, plenty of people saw this as totally harmless. Plenty of people saw it as kind of silly and a waste of money, but not that big a deal.
I see.
Some people felt it was very ominous. Some people felt that this was designed to be a sort of show of power, and a show of sort of this army is mine.
Wow. Wow. Let's see. Um, yeah. Let's take a break here. Stay with me
Sure.
as Dr. Khan and I get into the perspective. Dr. Khan, during the break, you mentioned that you have a recent paper with some interesting comparative aspects. I'd love to hear about it.
Well, so yeah, we've been talking a lot about the United States, but it may be interesting for people to think about how the United States is similar or different to other countries. And I've spent most of my time in European countries doing research there, comparing those places to the United States. Most of those countries have very similar civil military relations to the US. They're all essentially mature democracies, so they have the same kinds of models of civilian control. They have the same ideals of integrating military personnel with society instead of keeping them off separated. But
Hmm.
there are lots of other countries where, especially non-democracies, where the model of control may be very different. And so we spoke a little bit about how um, one of the main parts of the control model in democracies is a sort of socialization of military officers to believe that they are serving a legitimate government, right? That the government is executing the laws, the government is representing the people, and so they therefore ought to obey its orders. And that's one form of control. But if you're in an autocratic country or a non-democracy where the question of legitimacy is much more contested, you need a different version of control. And what a lot of non-democracies do is something called coup-proofing, which is basically where they take various measures, the various different kinds of measures, to try and weaken the military's either will or capability to interfere in politics. Now,
Oh.
non-democracies are not the only countries that do coup-proofing. Pretty much everyone does some form of it, but non-democracies engage in one particular kind of coup-proofing that democracies really shouldn't do, because it's inappropriate for democracy, and it's called stacking. And what that means
Hmm.
is when the political leadership tries to ensure that the military leadership is is permeated with people who are like them in some salient sense. So in some countries that's an ethnic tie, some countries it's a religious tie, some countries it's a linguistic tie, some countries it's many of those things. Some countries it's a political tie. So you can think of countries where so for example under Saddam Hussein's Iraq you had to be a well-regarded member of the Ba'ath Party, right, to be a high-ranking officer, and it didn't help if you were related to
Oh,
Saddam Hussein.
I see. Or like in Syria, the old Syria, you had to be one of
Yes,
the Alawite
yes,
tribes member or clan. I
yeah. So
see.
yeah, so the Alawite, the sect of Shiism
Hmm.
that the Assad family belonged to. Stacking is when, if you're an Assad family member and you're an Alawite Shia, you want to make sure that most of the high-ranking military officers are also Alawite Shia. And what that does is ensure that their interests are bound up with your interests, and it makes them want to protect you and not want to undermine your governance because their interests are tied up with yours. This, of course, is not appropriate in a democracy because the whole idea of a democracy is that leadership should be able to change. It should be able to change parties, it should be able to change people, and civil servants are supposed to serve whatever administration is in power, regardless of whether they like it or identify with it or not, right? So
Hmm.
this is the kind of thing that some people get concerned about when they see, for example, political loyalty tests being applied.
I see. Um, you just told us that you've spent a great deal of time outside the United States. In preparation for our conversation, I also noted that you have given lectures or in or about um, civil military relations in Germany, in the UK. I think there's one lecture or paper about Peru and other countries. Before I ask about your uh, professional sort of opinion, this is what I want to know. As an American being outside the United States, visiting and seeing their military and how they interact with the people, how did you feel? I'm not talking about your professional assessment.
Mhm.
Did you ever have a wow moment? Oh, this is different.
So I haven't had a lot of wow moments because most of these places I was pretty well familiar with before I went, but there have been a few, and I think the big one that comes to my mind was when I first learned that German military personnel are unionized. Um, that
Union, unionized in the military?
Yes, they have a military union. Now it doesn't have full union functionality, right? Because there are reasons why you wouldn't want militaries to go on
Yeah,
strike.
yeah,
But
of course.
it does they do have a union. And it early on in my sort of scholarly journey, I was living in Germany, which was one of the reasons I sound like this. I was living in Germany and found that not only do they have this union, but that union was instrumental in setting up the situation that would eventually lead to the European Court of Justice case that would cause the German government to lift the ban on women serving under arms. The
Oh,
union
wow.
set that up,
That
and
is a wow moment.
and it worked, right? And I
Yeah,
was just like, this would
yeah.
this would just not happen.
Wow.
Um, I think, the most startling thing that I ran into in my research in European countries had nothing to do with civil military relations, though. It was when I was doing my dissertation research, I had some what I thought were very straightforward questions about recruiting and retention in
Hmm.
various European countries. But I discovered quickly that most European countries don't have the mania for collecting data and statistics that the United States does. Um, Most of the countries I was studying couldn't answer most of my questions, um, which would have been unthinkable in the United States. There are a lot of reasons for it. Privacy laws in Europe are very different. But before that experience, it had just never occurred to me that people wouldn't know the answers to these questions, right? Like, how many recruits per year do you get with this kind of leaving certificate from school, right? They didn't know.
Do those countries that you're referring to in Europe, do they include like France and the UK and Germany?
Yes. So at that point, the UK had more statistics than the other countries that I visited. Although Ireland was hilarious because in Ireland, it's such a small military that when I asked them about these personnel records, they were like, "Oh yeah, that's Captain so and so. That's his job." And he's still a captain. He's been in the military for like 40 years and he personally knows all of this
I
stuff. And I
love
was like,
it.
"What happens when he retires?" But but I think this was in the early 2000s, and a lot of these countries, obviously the UK accepted and Ireland accepted, but a lot of the continental countries had only recently suspended or abolished conscription or were only just starting to. And so they had never really collected data on recruiting issues because they used conscription. I think now, if I went back now, I have the feeling that many of them would have more of this data. But at the
Yeah.
time, they were just like, Nobody ever asked. Like, nobody ever asked
Oh,
us that question."
so you think one factor that data is not available is that they had conscription all to up to recently.
At that time, yes,
Yeah.
early 2000s, they just
Interesting.
no one had ever asked that question or those questions. Yeah. So that was a surprise.
If you want our audience to remember just one point about civil military relations after everything we've talked about, what would that one point be?
I really think that it would be that the health of civil military relations, so as I described it before, it's this set of relationships among the society at large, their government, the military. The health of these relationships is derivative of the health of the democracy. If you're talking about a democracy, and I'm more interested in democratic civil military relations. So it's derivative of the health of the democracy overall. If the crisis is a crisis of political legitimacy and democratic governance, it's impossible to make tweaks that fix civil military relations problems. And possibly more important for people to recognize is that the military is not going to be in a position to save democracy. I think, many people say things like, oh, the adults in the room, or maybe they can constrain an out of control executive, etc., or maybe they'll disobey orders if they're bad orders. Um, some of them might, right? But I don't think it's fair for the public to think that the military can save democracy when the crisis is political legitimacy. Only the people can save democracy.
That's kind of
Um,
not their job.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I don't think we should put that on them.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Dr. Cohn, thank you so much for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much.